Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back to this week's edition of Advanced Bass Fishing. And man, I really appreciate you guys swinging by and watching it today. Always very grateful for that. And guys, got a really good seminar for y'all today. This is probably the most, this seminar right here, as far as ever since I started doing the Advanced Bass Fishing a few months ago, this is probably going to be the most important video in terms of you catching bass and being able to locate and find bass and getting them to hit in a variety of different situations. So we're going to be talking about weather and how it affects fish. And what I'm going to do in today's video, guys, is we're going to go over each month of the year, and I'm going to tell you in detail about how weather affects fish in terms of if it makes them bite better, if it turns them off, maybe some things that you can do to, counter whatever weather condition you're going to have. Because one thing is sure in bass fishing is you're never going to have the same weather. You've always got changing weather conditions, and it's a huge variable in the sport. So it's going to be a really good seminar here. This is going to, I'm not going to be showing any baits in this tournament. So this is going to be, you're going to be looking at my face here for an hour. So this is one of those good videos if you can, put the TV or your computer or phone on and go do something else and just listen to me talk so you don't have to look at me the whole time. So anyway, guys, before we get started, just a couple quick things here we do every week in return for all this info I'm giving you. If you guys like what's going on here in the channel and you really want to help support the channel, first thing is subscribing to the channel is a big deal. And then also please check out in the description, I'll put all the links that I have that really can help the channel out, like my Tackle Warehouse links, Solar Bat sunglasses, the Fish the Moment Lake Map breakdowns, all the stuff that you can do to support the channel is in the description. So if you guys would like to partake in that, that's a really good way to give back here. So much appreciated. Okay, guys, we'll get into this in depth here, man. This is one of those conversations. It could go on forever because there's literally an endless number of variables in fishing as far as the weather goes, how it affects fish in there. And one of the things in bass fishing that you're going to have to do, which nobody likes to do, is you got to adjust to changing weather conditions. And some of the most disheartening tournaments I've ever had, and some of the most disheartening days I've had in fishing have come when you have these weather changes that completely throw a wrench in what you're doing. Guys, I've had so many tournaments where, say it was the day before the tournament, and I just ripped them doing whatever the technique was, and it was real weather specific. Say, for example, I needed sun, or I needed clouds, or I needed wind, or I needed rain, and we had it one day, and then the next day it's gone. Let me give you one example, and we'll get into the seasonal weather stuff here in just a second, but let me give you one of the most prime examples that I can think of in terms of how drastic weather can affect fish. And I think I've told this on my channel one other time, but it's such a good example I want to reiterate here. I was fishing a tournament. This has been quite a few years ago down at Sam Rayburn Lake in Texas, and this was a March tournament. And March in Sam Rayburn is sort of the month of the spawn. That's, the water's in the low 60s. There's a lot of fish up shallow. And in that particular tournament, it was the day before the tournament, and we had ideal fishing conditions. It was cloudy out, it was warm, there wasn't much wind at all, everything was real stable, a lot of big fish up shallow, and I was catching them on a weightless lizard, which it'd be sort of like fishing a fluke today. This was 30 years ago when this happened. And guys, I had one of those days that was like a once in a lifetime day. I probably had, if it would have been a tournament, I'd have had easy 30 pounds on it, because I was fishing that lizard next to these clear water bushes, and you could see them. You throw that lizard up next to these bushes, and these big ones, like 5 to 8 pounders, they come out in slow motion like this and just grab the lizard in slow motion that far underneath the surface and swim off with it. And I had my hook cut off so I could shake them all off. And guys, this went on all day long. I went back to the hotel that night, and I'm thinking to myself, it's like, okay, I knew I was going to win the tournament. I was still young. I didn't know much about weather at this point, but I kept saying, okay, I'm going to win this tournament. It's like, but how much am I going to win it by? Am I going to win it by 30 or 40 or 50 pounds? I mean, it was unbelievable. Guys, that night, of course, something I knew was going to change, and that night we had a massive cold front come in. The temperature dropped 30 degrees overnight. It went, we turned, the south wind turned to the north and was blowing 30 miles an hour. Bluebird skies out. I went out the next day, guys, and never had a bite after catching the catch of a lifetime the day before. That is how quick the weather affects bass behavior. So that's one thing to always remember here. So anyway, let's get into this, guys. We're going to start, I'm going to go through the winter months, and then we're going to go through spring, summer, and fall. Now, winter, every season is unique to itself as far as how weather affects fish, as far as how different type of weather patterns will benefit you or hurt you. There's a lot of different variables that we'll talk about here. When you're talking in terms of things that can affect the bite, there's water clarity conditions, water temperature, the type of cover, how deep you're fishing. All these factors determine, the impact that certain weather patterns have on fish. Now, when you're talking winter months, let's talk about the months of like December, January, and February. That 3-month period that we're really right now at the time that I filmed this video. Most of the time, you're going to have temperatures that they're at their lowest point of the year. Well, not most of the time, they are. I mean, the wintertime, you're going to have your lowest temperatures of the year. And in correlation with that, you usually have the water is a little bit cleaner than normal because you don't have the sediment and the plankton and the algae blooming. And a lot of times the water's a little bit low. So you got cold water. Normally you got water that's a little bit low, and normally you've got, a little bit cleaner water with that. That's sort of the conditions there. Now, here is how weather patterns affect fish in a cold water environment like that. First of all, there's two different species, or there's two different populations of fish that you have to consider in any season on any lake. There's a population of fish that live offshore and deeper in almost every lake in the country. A lot of these fish suspend. These are the fish that people catch live scoping. And then there's another population of fish that live pretty shallow. They live less than 10 feet deep, even in the winter time of the year, and they don't suspend as much. They relate to the bottom, and that's just that population of fish. And it's divided up about how big a percentage that is. In the wintertime, I'm guessing that, it's sort of like an 80-20. I think about 80% of the fish are out deeper, 20% of the fish are a little bit shallower, and that's a give and take 10 or 15% based upon where you're out there. So when you're considering how the weather affects fish, you have to decide on which one of those groups of fish you fishing for. You fishing for the deeper fish or the shallower fish? Now in the wintertime, even if the water is cold, the weather affects fish pretty similar to it does in other times of the year. In the fact that I don't care if the water's 40 degrees, it's like if you have a day where the wind's blowing a little bit and maybe there's some cloud cover out, it's snowing, or maybe it's raining a little bit, in general, those fish are going to be a little bit more active. And not as much as in other times of the year, but in general, it makes them bite a little bit better, especially if you have a little bit cleaner water under those conditions there. And you have a lot of days like this in the wintertime. Wintertime, a lot of times you have cloudy, it can be cloudy for weeks on end here in Missouri. And a lot of times, when you have that, those shallower fish, bite a little bit better. And they bite a little bit better on a little bit more power fishing baits, which a lot of people don't associate wintertime with power fishing baits. But when I'm talking about that, I'm talking about crankbaits, jerk baits, that type of lure category, some swim baits even like that. And of course, depending upon what part of the country, it's going to be a huge outlier. Say, for example, if you guys are fishing wintertime at Toledo Bend Lake, it's not going to apply to anything what I'm talking about fishing up here in the Ozarks, or if you're fishing in Clear Lake in California, or if you're fishing Lake Cumberland in Kentucky. So it's hard for me I can't talk about the whole country in one group. So I've got to, when I do this, I've got to sort of maybe throw you guys a bone that fish down south a little bit, but gear it more towards the man-made impoundments. So anyway, in the wintertime, when you have those type of situations, it's going to make those fish a little bit more aggressive. Now, if you have a weather pattern that's a little bit, opposite of that, say you got bright conditions where you don't have much wind, Maybe it's colder, colder than normal, something like that. Situations that you would consider to be a little bit tougher. Those same fish are going to bite shallow, but you have to go to a more finessey approach. So let's say, for example, if you and I go fishing January 1st and it's 10 degrees above normal air temperature, cloudy, south wind, and we're catching them on a full-size jerkbait. And the next day we go out, cold front comes through, temperature drops 20 or 30 degrees. We don't have any wind. We got bright bluebird sky. We could probably still catch them on a jerkbait, but we have to downsize to a smaller profile. So in the wintertime, when you have the rising barometric pressures and you have the lower humidity levels, like that comes after front. Now we're going to be talking about pre and post frontal a lot in this video, but in the wintertime, those fish are still going to be there, but they're going to, bite a more downsized approach like that. Now, that is shallow water. If you're fishing those fish that are out deeper, suspended in the wintertime, like say they're, out off the end of the point and, they're suspended 20 foot down over 60 foot of water, those fish are going to be a lot less affected. There's a handful of techniques that you can actually catch those fish with that are suspended. So you're going to be using stuff like spoons, drop shots, small swim baits, ice jigs, traditional winter type lures. And since those fish are deeper and they're insulated from a lot of the weather patterns that trigger shallow fish to bite, you're not going to notice much of a difference in the day from day in to day out as far as how those deeper fish bite. Let's say, for example, we're down here at Table Rock Lake and we're fishing out in the middle of a creek channel over the top of some deep submerged timber. Say the water's 60, 80 foot deep, and say the timber comes up to 30 foot from the top. Those fish that are living out there in that deep water, regardless of what the weather is or the water temperature or whatever, they're there to stay. And they feed situationally and by timing. Their feeding is not dictated by light level intensities and wind that generate current and break up surface motion like they are in shallow water. So you don't have to have the adjustments for those deeper fish like you do the shallow fish. About the only adjustment that you may have is, maybe color adjustment, a little bit like that. Say, for example, if you're fishing a little, 2.5 inch, swim bait or something like that, on a real bright day, you might have like a real translucent looking color. And if it's cloudy out, you might have to put more of like a pearl on, something a little brighter. But your techniques are going to pretty much stay the same with that. So wintertime, in my opinion, guys, if you had all 4 seasons of the year, the weather has probably the least effect on the fish as it does any other time of the year. Because the other thing to remember about winter here is the influence of water temperature on the weather patterns. Because normally when you have an influence of a weather pattern, it will either drop the water temperatures, keep the water temperature the same, or cause the water temperature to rise. Certain seasons, that's more important than others. In the wintertime, that's not very important, because I don't care if you get a week of unseasonably warm weather, it's still not going to warm that surface temperature up that much, enough for those fish to make a big movement. They simply don't do it. They don't. In fact, one of the realities of wintertime fishing, I'll give you a good example, is say, for example, it's January and you look at the weather forecast and the weatherman says, man, it's going to be unseasonably warm. It's going to be 80 degrees. Say here in Missouri, our average high in January, say 45 degrees or 48 degrees. They say it's going to be 75 degrees tomorrow. Everybody heads out to the lake, think the fish are going to be real active because it's warmer, and they're not. They're probably less active because that water temperature, those fish don't react to it. Because another reason in the wintertime that they don't react to water temperature changes from weather patterns is the daylight hours actually influence the biology and the movements internally of a fish more than the water temperature does. So if there's anything that changes a bass movement, mood and behavior, it is the daylight hours getting a little bit longer incrementally. It's not the water temperature increasing with that, because those fish are locked down and they're committed. It's like when those fish are out deep like that, suspended in that timber, or if those fish are, say, living off the end of a main lake point in 10 or 15 foot of water in the wintertime, they're committed to that until you have some type of a major water temperature change. And that major water temperature change has to be something that's like a 5-degree change that occurs first thing in the morning. It's not the water temperature change that occurs like temporarily, like if you've had the sun beating down on the back of a cove all day long and the water warms up another 2 or 3 degrees, that's a fake water rise. The water temperature reality in the wintertime is how you measure it first thing in the morning on the main lake. And a lot of times that doesn't change until you have an extended period of warm up, usually towards the end of winter with that. So that's the basic winter patterns, how weather affects winter. I'm gonna get a little drink here and we're gonna come back with spring. Okay gang, we're back. Now let's get into the springtime of the year, about how weather affects bass in the spring. Now, every season every season out there, you have 3 distinct seasons within a season. Like in the wintertime, you have early winter, midwinter, and late winter. And in the springtime of the year, you have the pre-spawn period, and then what's considered the spawn period, and then the post-spawn period. So in the springtime of the year, you got 3 different phases that the fish are in, and the weather will influence the springtime bass in each one of those phases a little bit differently. So right off the bat, we'll talk about the pre-spawn period. Now, if you guys have watched much of my stuff before, you know that the pre-spawn period is my favorite time to fish. It's, in general, you're going to catch the biggest fish of the year fishing in the pre-spawn. That's when there's more big fish shallow than any other time of the year. And not only those bigger fish shallow, but they're more catchable, again, if you have the right weather conditions. Now, there's 2 times a year that the weather plays a huge role in fishing more than others. It's the springtime of the year, really the early and mid-spring, and then again, it's the mid to late fall. Those are the 2 times a year that really have a big impact on different weather patterns. Winter and summer are probably the least 2 that have the biggest impact. So when you're talking about pre-spawn here, one of the things that you have to consider about pre-spawn is, since these big fish are starting to move shallow, this is the time of year where you want nastier conditions. There's no question about it. It's like when you start getting into the hardcore pre-spawn phase, when that water temperature starts warming up into the low to mid 50s, there's a big movement of these quality fish, like these fish over 3 pounds that are moving up shallower. I'm not talking about moving up right on the bank, but they're moving out of those deeper water suspended areas, and they're staging, getting ready to move up to spawn. So you got great numbers of these quality fish moving up into less than 10 foot of water. Now, when you have these fish up in less than 10 foot of water, especially big fish like that, this is when weather is so critical as far as getting them to bite. And this is when those nasty days are the days you want to be out there. If you're out there in the pre-spawn, let's say you're out there in March, water temperature is 55 degrees, and you've got a day out there where you got a 10, 15 mile an hour south wind, it's humid, you got some type of front on the way, the clouds are moving in, maybe it's getting close to the front and it's starting to rain a little bit. Guys, hold on. There's not a better time of year to fish. If you get a low light, nasty type day, I don't mean like a nasty, honking thunderstorm. I'm talking about just a windy, average to above average temperature day with maybe some rain and clouds. That's going to be your biggest days as far as catching big fish and big numbers of big fish. And that's when you want to pull out the big baits. In the spring, in the pre-spawn of the year, if you get one of those days that are like there, put on your big spinner baits with your number 8 willow leaf blades, big thumping blades, big chatter baits, big jigs, big swim baits, glide baits, that type of stuff. Take advantage of those big fish being up, moving and being aggressive with that. Now, on the flip side of that, there's always like a, sort of 2 ends of the coin on here, is that time of year when you're talking about the pre-spawn, there's not another time of year where the weather affects bass as negatively as during the pre-spawn. Because, what are you doing over there? Okay. Elijah's got a board here. He's been counting to 1,000 with dots on it here. Do you need a marker?
Yeah, I need a marker.
Okay, let me get him a marker here just a second. Here, I'm gonna give you one of these markers. Let's see here. You got an orange one. I don't have a red one. Okay, get him squared away there. So, okay. Got to get his board up in the boat here. Okay, there you go. Okay, so on the flip side of the coin, there's not another time of year where a front influences bass negatively like it does in the pre-spawn. And that tournament I just told you about starting out in the video at Sam Rayburn is a perfect example. If you get a day where a front comes through and you lose either you lose your wind, or you get your north wind, or you have an increased light level, you lose your clouds, it's bluebird conditions, you lose your humidity, everything that's associated with the front, it will shut those big fish down in a second. Not to say they won't bite, they'll still bite, but you just have to change your tactics and your techniques. Instead of like catching them on a big spinnerbait and a chatterbait, you may have to pick up a jig, catch them on a jig, catch them on a shaky head, catching them finessing around a little bit like that. They're still there, but they're just not going to bite as good. And this lasts usually for a couple days until the weather starts stabilizing there. Now, the pre-spawn time of the year, there's also that same population of fish that is still deep a little bit, because not all the fish, when I'm talking about the pre-spawn, is you have fish moving shallow, you don't have all the fish moving shallow. So you still have a percentage of those fish that are coming in a little bit late. So one of the things you can do, guys, if you don't like fishing up shallow with big spinnerbaits and stuff like that, you can still fish those traditional winter type areas like your deeper points, your main and secondary points, your ditches, with like swim baits and stuff like that. And you can still catch them in the pre-spawn, jerk baits even. You can still catch them in the pre-spawn while some guys are up on the bank. So there's something a little bit for everybody then. And again, those deeper fish, even in the pre-spawn, are not going to be affected with that. But you're going to hear this reoccurring theme a little bit as far as the bass turning off after a front comes through. And a lot of people there's not really a reason for that. A lot of people can intellectualize, why they don't bite as good after a front comes through. But I think a lot of it's speculation. I think a lot of it has to do with the food chain, everything from the plankton and the algae being moved around or not moved around, with the bait fish, perched, and then the whole food chain above that. So it's sort of a big mystery with that. Now, this is going to last up until when the fish start spawning. Now, most of the fish in the lake are going to start spawning usually around the first full moon, once you start hitting around 60-degree water temperature. So that can vary depending upon what part of the country you're in. But once you start hitting that magic 60-degree mark, and you start coming up on a full moon or a new moon, something like that, you've got a lot of those bigger fish that you were catching, in the pre-spawn staging areas, moving up into their spawning areas, along with a lot of smaller males. So during the actual spawn, there's probably even more fish than there was during the pre-spawn, but there's a little bit more diversity in size. Now, this is another time of year, guys, where the window of when the fish are spawning, as far as the weather influencing those fish, doesn't have quite as much impact, because the pre-spawn period and the post-spawn period, the weather has more of an impact than during the actual spawn, simply because during the spawn, the fish are not actively feeding a lot. The fishing's still good, don't get me wrong, but that's because they're trying to protect, they're guarding, they're aggressive as far as the whole bedding routine out there. And one of the things that you're going to find out about the weather when those fish are really, really keyed in on spawning, and I don't mean actually when they're on the bed, I'm talking about when they're swimming up, cruising into the shallows, looking for bedding areas, scouting for bedding areas, building beds, bedding, guarding fry after that, the whole bedding process, the weather is pretty much irrelevant to catching fish out there for the most part, because what you're going to find is when those fish get locked down on really, really focused on spawning, they don't want to hit any moving baits very well. You can catch them on flukes and floating worms occasionally, but for the most part, you're going to do a lot better pitching and flipping around soft plastics, stuff like, brush hogs and beavers and, Cincos and stuff like that, slinkies, shaky heads, drop shots, that type of deal. They really like to get locked down more on the bottom because they're focused on spawning. They're not really concerned about what's up over their heads or what's swimming by them there. They're concerned about, protecting that bedding area, and those eggs are on the bottom, so they're focused on the bottom there. Excuse me. So anyway, during the actual spawn part of it, the weather is least of a factor than anything. You can catch them pretty much under any weather condition. Now, as that transition occurs into the post-spawn, where most of those fish get done spawning, you're still going to have some fish hanging around garden fry, garden eggs, just living shallow for another month. And at this point, they're starting to want to get to feed up again. I don't care if you're a male or a female bass, you've expended a lot of energy either laying eggs or growing eggs or producing eggs or keeping bluegills out of the nest or garden fry or whatever. These fish are exhausted, and they're ready to eat. So being ready to eat like that, again, the weather becomes super important as far as their windows of feeding opportunity. Now, the windows of feeding opportunity during the post-spawn are not as critical as they are during the pre-spawn with that. The only thing that it does is it changes your techniques. You're going to find that the bass are most aggressive and they feed the most and they bite the most the first couple 2 to 3 weeks after the fish get done spawning. They'll hit about anything. They'll hit moving baits, they'll hit topwater baits, they'll hit slow baits, they'll hit everything. And the thing that you have to decide is you have to let the weather conditions dictate the technique that you're fishing. Because let's say, for example, you know where a cove where there's a bunch of fish spawning at. You go back in that cove and you don't see any fish on beds, but maybe you see fish cruising around. Now, like on a calm, bright day or something like that, where you got a lot of, sunlight conditions, high light intensity, things like casting a wacky rig out there, some slow floating wacky rig that they can see real good. It's a great way to catch them. If you've got, some type of a day where it's cloudy and windy, you can go back in that same area and throw like a big swim bait, like a 6 or 7 inch swim bait, like a Megabass Mag Draft, and catch them. If the sun would be out and you don't have your wind, you may not get a bite on a Mag Draft one day, but you may come back the next day with the Mag Draft and the wind's blowing 20 and it's cloudy and you catch a big bag of fish in the exact same water. Those fish that you're catching on the Mag Draft in the nasty conditions, you'll be able to go back there, with a shaky head or a wacky rig or something like that on a calm day, if it's bright out, and catch them during those conditions. Sorry guys, I'm getting over, I was sick last week, so getting over a cold. So don't let the weather conditions influence your thought as far as how the bass, how inactive or active they are. When that water temperature is between like 60 and 75 degrees, they are going to be active and they're going to be feeding. You just have to let the day and the weather conditions dictate the technique that you use. Like anything else, it's the nasty, windy, low light days are going to be better for your moving baits, like your top waters, like your swim baits, like your glide baits, all that type of stuff. And then on the brighter type days, it's simply finessing around a little bit more. Now, the reason this is when you have wind and you have clouds and you have sunlight angles that are different that create lower water levels, it's easier for fish to make a mistake because they don't have the visual capacity that they do on those bright days without wind. Because when it's windy, you got to think about it. If you're a bass and the wind's blowing 20 miles an hour, it creates a completely different environment. Number one, it creates some current through the water if it's windy, and it breaks up the surface. So you can't see what's up there on the surface. You can't clearly see that top water, exactly what it is coming across a rough surface. But if it's glass smooth and the wind's not blowing at all, you can see it perfectly. I mean, you can see exactly what's up there, and it's easier for those fish to make a mistake when it's windy and cloudy versus when it's not. So that's why you sort of have to adjust your techniques accordingly to those type of conditions. But that's the time of the year that you just need to stay shallow, guys. If there's one time of the year that you don't have to turn that live scope on, if you're a live scoper, it's during the late pre-spawn, spawn, and early post-spawn. There's just a ton of fish shallow there. Okay, so anyway, we're gonna get into the summer months here, take a little break and get a drink here, and we'll be right back. Okay, gang, we're back with summer now. Summer is absolutely, without a doubt, the time of year where weather patterns affect fish the least. Not even anything close with that. Not to say that it doesn't affect it a little bit, but compared to spring and winter and fall, it's pretty much a non-issue, because a lot of times in the summertime, guys, fish are completely committed to the water that they're in, whether it be deep or shallow, and you don't have those type of weather patterns. Excuse me. Sorry, you don't have those type of weather patterns in the summertime, guys, that have drastic temperature drops. In the winter, spring, and fall, you can have temperature swings of like 30 degrees in one particular day. But in the summertime, once usually June, July, and August gets around here, you simply don't have those type of radical weather changes like that. You've got some changes that, like when a front comes through in the summertime of the year, it doesn't usually last very long, and it's usually not associated with a big temperature drop. So therefore, you don't have a big adjustment with the fish. Now, in the summertime, again, just like every other time of the year, you've got, two populations of fish. After those fish spawn and they start to get into their early summer patterns, like in June, July, and August, you got a lot of those fish that will move out deeper on points, around brush, around drop-offs, ledges, whatever structures that you have. Some of them may be suspended out there. And then you have a large population of the fish that will stay shallow all summer. They're up shallow feeding on bluegills. They're living underneath boat docks. They're living, shallow cover, stumps, grass, whatever that you have there. Now, the way that the weather affects those particular type of fish are very similar out there. Let's say, for example, if you're deep cranking a river ledge in late June on Kentucky Lake or something out there, if those fish are out there on that ledge and they're schooled up, it doesn't make any difference if you go out there and it's cloudy or clear, or if the wind's blowing or if the wind's not blowing. That's not going to make those fish bite or not bite. There's going to be other variables to that. And it's the same way if you're, throwing a crankbait down a rocky bank out there. If you have wind or not wind, there's other variables more important that are like water visibility and shade that may come into more of an impact there. So when you're talking in terms of weather patterns and weather variables in the summertime, the main thing is simply the cloud cover. It doesn't have much to do with the wind or the lack of the wind or anything like that, or the humidity that goes with it. It has to do with the cloud cover. And the cloud cover has a very, very minute effect on those deeper offshore fish. Every offshore experience I've had in the summertime, whether it be fishing deep grass or ledges or drop-offs or whatever like that, timber, doesn't make any difference if it's cloudy, sunny or whatever. But the difference that weather makes in the summertime is completely related to summertime fish. And the summertime fish that are shallow are relating to shade. Now, what I'm talking about here is, say you're on Logan Martin Lake in the middle of July or August, and the sun's beating down, you got no wind, not a cloud in the sky, and you're flipping docks on Lake Logan Martin. Now, you're going to have specific shade lines under those docks where those fish positioned at different times of the day. But if you have a cloudy day, those fish aren't going to be as easily positioned or caught. It's like on a sunny day, you can throw and you can pitch it up into those dark shady areas, with a Texas rig or a jig or a wacky rig or whatever, and really be able to pinpoint those fish. But on days where it's cloudy out there, not so much. You may have one fish way underneath a dock, you may have another fish on the outside of the dock, but it doesn't influence how well they bite. It just influences their position on that. And it's the same, let's say if we're throwing a square bill crankbait down a rocky bank. Mm-hmm.
Can you move my operation away from the punching bag because I want to punch it?
Okay. So in other words, the level of aggressiveness that comes with the fish, with the weather pattern, does not really change much in the summertime. It just changes the position of those fish. And sometimes it will change like the color that your lure dictates. let's say, for example, let's go back to the dock example on Logan Martin Lake. Let's say, for example, it's super bright out. You may be catching them in that situation, since the light intensity is a lot more on like a watermelon Cinco or a watermelon stick bait. And then say, for example, you get a day where it's cloudy in July, maybe you got a thunderstorm rolls through there. That's when you go to a black and blue or June bug, something a little bit stands out a little bit more in those light conditions. So anyway, Elijah's hitting the punching bag over here, so I think I'm gonna have to take a break with that. But the summer chapter, guys, is pretty short with that. One other thing that I'll leave you with on the summer here is that sometimes a strong wind in the summertime, if you have a system that comes through that wind's blowing 20, 25 miles an hour, sometimes that can be a benefit because the wind will create current. And in mid to late summer, when you have lower oxygen levels, sometimes that increase in current can get those fish a little bit more aggressive, especially like for shallow cranking or topwater fishing. So I have seen times where a strong wind will, actually really help the bite out in certain situations. So anyway, guys, we're gonna get Elijah off of this bag. We'll be back and wrap it up with the fall section, with the fall time of the year, weather patterns, which again is a really important time of year for us. We'll be okay, guys, sorry for the interruptions in the summer section there. Elijah was out here, he's a little tired of me being out here for so long filming videos. So anyway, guys, let's get into the fall time of the year. And like I said, I don't want to make it to sound like summer is just a completely a non-issue with weather. It does influence, the fish a little bit, like we talked about. But again, it doesn't have that big of an impact out there. I have not seen the fish be that, dependent or non-dependent on weather. It's like there's other factors that time of year that's more important. It's like, oxygen levels, water levels, fishing pressure, recreational boating pressure. There's other variables that have a lot more impact than the weather does. Now, on the flip side of the coin, when you start getting to the fall, you're starting to get into the second most important time of the year as far as technique, how weather patterns affect the fish. Now, this happens sort of gradually because when I consider fall like September, October, November. Not so much with September, because when you start to get into September, most of the time you're still in some late summer patterns. Even though I consider September a fall month, a lot of times water temperatures are still hot. So I haven't noticed a big impact that weather patterns have in the month of September. But once you start to get in October and especially into November, they play heavily into it. Now, what happens again is a lot of times water levels are starting to drop. You're losing your thermocline, and when you lose your thermocline, a lot of those deeper fish that were out suspended above the thermocline all summer, they start to disperse a little bit, and they disperse in a lot of different levels. That's why in the fall time of the year, you can have fish in 2 foot of water, you can have fish in 60 foot of water on the bottom, and you can have fish suspended 30 foot down, just depending upon the lake that you're fishing. But in general, this is what happens, is the first biggest impact that weather has during the fall time of the months of October and November is your temperature change at night. Those cooler nights that you start having consistently in October, these are the things that really get that water temperature to consistently start dropping. And a lot of times by the time that you get to the mid part of October or to the end of October, you're going to have one of those bad fronts that come through there that really drop the water temperature. Now, here is the factor that determines it. Once that water temperature falls to about probably 15 degrees or so below the max of what it was in the summertime, most of the time you'll have water temperatures in the summertime in the 80s in most lakes. Once that temperature starts getting down around 70 or below, that's when the weather patterns really start affecting the fish. And it's almost like the weather patterns, whatever those weather patterns are that are abnormal from the norm, really helps that fishing out a lot. It really makes the fish bite a lot better, especially on those low light, nasty days. Now, one of the reasons for this is you've got, again, 2 separate populations of fish in the fall time of the year, actually more than 2 separate populations, because, you have fish, again, using all all depths of the water column simply because there's no stratification that like there were in the summertime of the year, and the water temperatures are still warm to have a bigger population of fish shallow. And these fish, again, are in the feeding mode a little bit more. In different times of the year, they may not be in the feeding time of the feeding mode that much during the daytime, but in the fall time of the year, they start more actively feeding in the day. In the summertime of the year, most of your feeding goes on at night, and the fish that you catch during the daytime in the summer, for the most part, you're catching out of reaction strikes. But in the fall time, since those fish know winter's around the corner and they're feeding up a little bit, they're actively feeding. And the act of feeding always occurs better during the low light conditions. So that's why wind and clouds are key factors in fall fishing. If you've got wind and clouds, say in the end of October, it will activate shallow fish that you don't even know that are there under normal conditions. Let's say, for example, you and I go down to Table Rock Lake and we're fishing the last week of October. And it's a typical fall day. Say it's partly cloudy, maybe you got a 5-mile-an-hour wind, air temperature's normal, say it's 72 degrees, something like that. And we go out and we try to catch them on a walking topwater or a glide bait or something like that. We might never get a bite, and you may conclude the fact that, well, there's just no fish there like that. So we go back the next day, front's coming in, we got clouds, maybe it starts raining about 10 o'clock in the morning, wind picks up out of the south, it's 15, 20 mile an hour wind. We go back and we start fishing that topwater, we start fishing that glide bait and the swim bait, and we start wrecking them. Those fish were there the whole time. They didn't just move up there. Those fish were there the whole time, hunting perch, hunting crawdads, but they wouldn't bite because of the conditions out there. Once again, the low light conditions, the nastier weather allowed them to make mistakes that they would normally not make other times. That is when you really have to take advantage of that out there. And one of the things I can tell you about fall fishing, guys, is you can't force fish to bite in the fall time of the year unless you have the right weather conditions to do so. Because if you go back out there the next day and you lose your wind and you lose your clouds and you try to do the same thing with the big power baits, you're not going to catch any fish. In the fall time of the year, you have got to be versatile. You have got to be able to fish shallow, and you got to be able to fish deep. You can't be one of those guys that's hard-headed and say, I'm going to put a whopper plopper in my hand and throw it all day long and go for broke, because most of the time you're going to go broke doing that unless you have the right set of conditions. So one of the things I highly recommend in the fall time of the year is be prepared for different weather patterns that come through. If you're one of those guys that likes to get out there and doodle and weenie worm around for suspended fish out off a point in 20 foot of water, go for it. And if you get a day where it's bright and there's not much wind, that's a great way to catch them. But if don't stay out there and do that, if you have those nasty weather conditions come in, that's when you have to go put that glide bait and that swim bait on there. Another time of year that another weather pattern that's really going to help you out in the fall time of the year along with that is rain. I think that in the fall time of the year, rain, and especially a cold rain that's borderline on snow, that activates fish more than anything else, more than any other time of the year. If you get one of those, heavy rains, cold rains in the springtime of the year, late winter or something like that, or even a rain in the summertime of the year, it's not going to have that big of an impact. If you say, for example, if you get a rainy day in the middle of August out there, don't expect to get right up on the bank and just catch a bunch of fish because it's raining, because it's not going to happen. You may pick up one or two more than what you expected to do, but you're not going to go out and wreck them. But if you get one of those days in late October or November where it's raining or snowing, be prepared for a great day on the water, because those fish will turn on immediately with that. Now, you've got those fish up there that are resident fish. They're living up there in the late fall, like October and November. But I think also when you get one of those days out there that those fish know that are a prime feeding day, those low light level days, I think it pulls fish even out of deep water to come in there. Not all of them. It's not going to pull a lot of those fish that are suspended way out off the bank. But if you've got some fish living out on the end of a point in 25 foot of water and it's raining, it doesn't take anything for those fish to swim 50 feet and get up on that bank and start feeding out there. Guys, I can't tell you how many days, again, fishing different lakes across the country. I don't care. I've had days on Lake Lanier doing this, on Douglas Lake in Tennessee, Eastern Kentucky lakes, even in like Lake Okeechobee and the Harris Chain out there. When you get those type of days out there, that you get that rain and you get those nasty days out there, the lake can light up like you can't believe how many fish are in there, and then the next day it's completely gone. Spinnerbait fishing is a prime example of this. One of the best times to fish a spinnerbait is during the month of November on a nasty day. And I've had days out there where I've caught 30, 40 fish in November on a spinnerbait during those nasty days. And then the next day comes along and you can't get a bite with that. So you have to adjust with that. And the main thing about weather, guys, is when you're in review of this whole thing out here, you have got to take advantage of the weather as it comes. And a lot of this can happen hour by hour by hour, because let's say, for example, we go fishing in the month of November out there, and we get out there and the water temperature's 58 degrees, and it's sunny when we take out in the morning. If there's clouds moving in or something like that, say clouds move in at 10:30, it starts mist and rain at 12:30 in the afternoon, you have got to make an adjustment, because in the fall time of the year, the fish will adjust like that. There's not like this hesitation. It's not like in different times of the year that you have to have this extended period of low light or bad weather conditions to get these big groups of fish to move up. In the fall time of the year, they react immediately to it like that. So take advantage of it all the time. And that's the ultimately one of the most difficult things about bass fishing, guys, is being able to adjust to different weather conditions, especially if something you were doing is working. If you're catching fish on a certain technique under a certain weather pattern, it's a natural tendency to want to keep forcing that and to keep using that and to keep trying that. But one of the biggest pieces of advice that I can give you guys in bass fishing is you've got to put that fear, compartmentalize that fear, and put it aside and adjust to the conditions as they come. I'll give you guys a prime example of a fall time adjustment that you can make on the water out there. Last fall, I was throwing a square bill crankbait on Grand Lake. And when I got out there in the morning, it was, there was pretty heavy, partly overcast. The water visibility was like 2 feet. And I was catching them on a chartreuse side with a blackback square bill, just cranking rocky banks with it. And this lasted up until about 9 o'clock. And about 9 o'clock, I lost the clouds. The clouds moved out of there, the wind died a little bit, the sun started getting up a little bit overhead, and I could look down in there and I could see the crankbait farther down in the water because we had higher light intensity. So they quit biting that bright crankbait, and I changed to a more subtle shad pattern and started catching them again. This lasted a couple hours, and towards the afternoon, sun started getting down at a lower angle, started getting some shade on those banks that I was fishing, and I noticed that my shad pattern crankbait was getting harder to see in the water, and I wasn't catching them as good, so I changed back to the brighter color and started catching them again. That is what bass fishing is all about as far as adjusting to weather conditions. You have to adjust hour by hour to the light intensities, and ultimately, this is what a lot of weather patterns, how they affect bass. It has to do with the light intensity. Light intensity is a huge factor, guys, in determining the aggressiveness of the fish, the color of the lure that you're fishing, the style and the profile of the lure you're fishing. The light intensity is a big, big factor with that. And of course, there are other factors than weather, like barometric pressure, humidity, wind, all that type of stuff that play into it too. And a lot of it is speculation. We're speculating how weather affects fish in a certain way, but ultimately the way that weather affects fish is it affects the entire biology and the entire ecosystem of a lake, from the plankton and zooplankton up to the minnows, up to the perch, everything like that. is affected by the weather patterns. It's not just the bass that are affected by that. The bass are just reacting to those changes and the changing environmental conditions to the biology of the lake. So it's another reason why bass fishing, guys, is the most difficult sport in the world. There's just so many dang things to consider with it. And just when you think you figure something out and that you know what's going on, you realize how much that you don't. Nobody's ever going to have all the answers, guys. I don't care who it is. I don't care if you're one of those live scopers that it's on fire right now and think you got the world by the balls and you got it figured out, you're in for a rude awakening because you don't. I mean, if you're the guy that's been flipping a jig for 30 years in shallow bushes and you think you understand that, you don't got it figured out. Bass fishing is a mystery, man. There's so many uncontrolled variables to the sport, along with the controlled variables, that you're never going to get figured out. So just go out there, guys. Don't take it too serious. Relax, enjoy, have a good time, and don't be scared to make adjustments with the weather out there, because you've got to be able to do that. And the more that you trust yourself and the more easily that you adjust to conditions, the more successful you're going to be in having a lot more consistency and catch them. So anyway, guys, thanks for tuning in this week. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll be back next week.